Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Skee Mask, Resort. It's interesting to think about how much my perception of Skee Mask has changed over the past several years since he really first broke out. I admittedly wasn't paying attention when this German producer first got groundswell in the underground, putting out releases under the name Scientist, SCNTST, in the early 2010s, or of course his eventual signing to the Ilion tape label and putting out his debut album under the Skee Mask name in 2016, Shred. He'd been building up a reputation for himself for making remarkably solid and moody mixes of breakbeats and classic 90s ambient techno sound palettes. But that was before I finally took notice in 2018 when he put out his second album, Compro, an album that had gotten so much acclaim from people on the scene that he couldn't be ignored anymore. At the time, I almost felt like this guy had just come out of nowhere and become one of the most well-acclaimed new artists working in electronic music overnight. In one breath, I pretty much agreed with the majority of the hype Compro had amassed at the time. I marked it as one of my favorite albums of that year and found its wide variety of different ambient and breakbeat explorations to be really striking and easily replayable. And I even shouted it out in my video of essential albums from the entire 2010s decade, feeling like it had become such a notable big event in the underground that really stuck in my mind. But back then, I always had some level of doubt in my mind on how much staying power the guy would have longer term. My perspective at the time was that he was really damn good at emulating various sounds and styles from old classic 90s records, but he wasn't pushing the genre forward in any way or doing anything new that lots of other different artists from decades past hadn't already done. Not to mention, I couldn't tell whether the success of Compro was a one-off fluke, especially considering I was a lot less hot on his debut back then and found that album to blend a lot more into the scene without standing out as much. It wasn't until 2021 came around and he released his third album, Pool, when I finally got convinced that this guy really was here to stay and had the potential to sit among the actual legends that inspired him. That album took everything I liked about Compro and brought it to the next level, exploring an even wider variety of styles, bringing in a selection of 18 tracks adding up to over an hour and a half of music that somehow still ended up really easily replayable in its full entirety and never once felt its length. Even if I still felt Compro had a couple of higher high points, Pool made the way he went about his particular style look almost effortless, as if he could just keep consistently releasing stuff on the same level as Compro for a long time to come. And of course, it ended up as my number one favorite album of that year. On top of that, in the years since Pool came out, I've started to rethink my initial impression of his style merely being pastiches of other artists from the 90s without necessarily providing that much of a unique spin on those sounds that he could call his own. I feel like the most notable development for electronic music in the 2020s decade so far has been like the revival of pretty much every electronic style that was popular in the 90s and 2000s but had gone out of favor in the 2010s. Like, the mainstream electronic scene right now is almost entirely preoccupied with 90s house these days. Jungle breakbeats made a big comeback. Even the dubstep scene started reverting back to the classic style that was big in the era when Burial still released albums. There's lots more artists, both new and old, who are bringing back their favorite traditionalist electronic formulas just as Skee Mask did. And yet, the deluge of 90s revivalism in the past couple of years has only done more to highlight how Skee Mask just always had that it factor to set himself apart in retrospect. Even as his scene got a lot more saturated, his music still stood out as something special. The more artists who came out that were trying to do similar stuff to him somehow just made it all the easier to tell a Skee Mask production apart from the crowd. I even finally went back to Shred while preparing for this video, and that album only now finally started clicking with me after all these years of my thinking it was nothing special. Even if I still feel like Compro and Pool improve upon everything that album did, and a lot of it does still have a tendency to run together for me, he did still nail down his signature style there of moody ambient breakbeats that both had the nice atmosphere and the harder-hitting bangers to back itself up. There are some proper gems on there like Shred 08, Mel's Cop 2, Panorama, and South Mathematics. So, of course, needless to say, when he dropped his fourth album here, Resort, out of nowhere with zero lead-up, I had some proper expectations now. I just excitedly jumped in, hoping to get more cool stuff in his usual style. And, well, that's sort of what I got, but Resort is also kinda different from any of his other previous albums. I've seen this album described by fans as the summer counterpart to the more wintry feel of his first two albums, And there is definitely some truth to that in the way that a lot of the melodic flourishes around most of these tracks here have more warmth and maybe a bit more color to them. But I think the most notable point about Resort that sets it apart from his previous work is that this is easily his most ambient-centric album to date. Like, I guess his sound was already pretty laid back to begin with, but it feels like this album is even more preoccupied with that more laid back side to his sound. Not to the point where it forgets to also have the bangers to balance things out. There's plenty of that too, not to worry. Once again, this is still easily recognizable as a Skee Mask album, but the shift in favor of warmer ambience is very noticeable right down to the album's title. And in terms of my own personal enjoyment, it's also been a weirdly difficult one to digest. I've probably listened to this album in full like 7 times at this point, and nearly every listen I've given it feels like I'm listening to it for the first time. As in, I put it on, an hour disappears, and I haven't really been able to parse anything, as if all of it just kinda went in one ear and out the other. Okay, to be fair, that's not the case for everything here. There are definitely plenty of great individual moments on this thing, but there have also been a lot of listens I've given this thing where the entire thing just fell into the background. All of it is pleasant and refreshing to have on even in its least interesting moments, and the listening experience has never gotten stale or tedious no matter how many times I've put it on. I feel like I could just as easily listen to this thing another 7 times and still have my feelings sitting at pretty much the exact same point with it. But yeah, there are definitely parts of this thing that clicked for me a lot more than others. Half of this album is properly great and half of it is just generally kinda cool but leaves me wishing it left more of an impact than it did. And the half that's just generally kinda cool and not as impactful to me is pretty much just the first half. Yeah, in particular, I'm a little on the fence over how this album structures itself. This thing starts out with all its lowest key and most ambient-centric moments all gathered together at the very beginning, and like very slowly ramps up the energy level over time in such a way that hides the presence of a specific point where it feels like the album gets going. In one breath, that does mean the album's flow is extremely smooth and it makes an otherwise decently varied project feel much more like a single cohesive experience. But on the other hand, I feel like this structuring is a recipe for me to zone out early on, and flowing so smoothly means I can possibly even entirely miss moments that would otherwise be standouts. I'm not sure if starting out so slow and sequencing these tracks in such a way that made them run together so much necessarily did the album any particular favors. It's not like this album is trying to be a continuous mix either, or like actually physically transition these tracks into each other in a clever way. Opening with an entirely ambient track like Hedwig Transformation Group could theoretically work as like an intro. The waves of melodic pads are very nice and peaceful, could serve the same purpose in the album as an old track of his like Sero Verb. But I feel like that track was able to stand out as much as it did for me because it was immediately followed by the much more striking session ad as a device for the album to really feel like it got started. Meanwhile, this album starts with 2 ambient tracks in a row, immediately floating from the minimal ambience of the opener into Nastaglitch, a track which is admittedly a fair bit more expansive and layered, with all these warped electric piano lines going up next to various other pads floating in and out. It's exceptionally pretty, and there's also some light, not really drum and bass beat work being faded in very slowly over the last minute or so of the track, though this acts more as a device for the album to more smoothly transition into the handful of slightly more beat-centric tracks that follow, which are still a little on the muted and low energy side. See following track, Reminisce Remix? Or what, I don't know. That's the first track to bring back his trademark skittering breakbeats, but the leads that are carrying the melody on top feel rather oily and limp and don't actually have that much of a tune to them, even if there is a lot of really nice and well-textured melodic ambience being built around it. Now, the first track on the album that I can consistently at least notice when it starts is Element. This cut has a thicker techno flavor to it, starts out with some stomping kicks that make for a more striking rhythmic texture that stood out to me more, and the pattern of low-key and muted melodic synth blips carrying through much of it is decently catchy. It's a very gray and downbeat kind of track, in the way many other old Skee Mask tracks are. But you know, it is a low-key grower and probably my favorite track in this opening stretch. Meanwhile, following track Waldmeister is another mostly formless kind of track that blends in the background for me more often than not. But there is still a cool idea behind this one. Like, all the various layers of ambient synths and pads floating around this one almost start to have a tiny bit of a faux symphonic flavor to them, and there's like a barely present kick drum underneath the entire mix to give it more of a sense of propulsion. And the final effect feels like Skee Mask trying to do his take on Gas, trying to tribute or deliver his own more polished spin on Wolfgang Voigt's easily recognizable style, right down to the track title making a reference to the forest, Wald. So that's pretty neat. I fuck with that. But anyway, if there's any point at which I might say this album starts to properly get going for me, it's probably the next track, Daytime Gamer. If I'm not mistaken, this is a pretty old track of his, which he put out a version of on an EP years ago. To be honest, I haven't actually been paying attention to Skee Mask's EPs out of my typical preference for albums. But it is the first track on the album to hit the level of properly great. The mood behind it is very light and mellow as everything else on the album has been thus far, but it's maybe the brightest and warmest track we've gotten yet on the album, building up some solid TR-808 drum machine beats with all these nostalgically floaty loops of electric pianos that make for something resembling a solid hook, and even some particularly emotional and spacious string samples swirling around everything in a number of parts. It's just such a nice and uplifting and summery vibe. So yeah, that one's definitely one of the biggest highlights for me. From here onwards, the second half of the album is a lot more energetic and beat-driven than anything the first half focused on. Schneiders' Paradox gets a little more house-ish with some slightly harder-hitting beat work and all these blippy, dub-techno-y synth chords before the breaks start to come in more underneath partway through. And if you really wanted the break-heavy stuff, then BB Care focuses more on that as well, although in a much more odd and off-kilter manner that doesn't bang as hard. I guess there's something of a jungle drum and bass flavor to it, although it's really sparse, if that, with very little melodic elements outside of a few wispy pads and the percussion staying pretty light until banging markedly harder for a brief spurt at the end of each couple of measures. I also feel like there's a bit more of a hip-hop flavor to this one. There's some light DJ scratching in some parts too. So yeah, that one's fun. I always enjoy when Skee Mask tries on those particular kinds of more organic sounding palettes and breakbeats to change things up a bit. There is one last wholly ambient track in this stretch of the album in Terminal Z, although this one's much darker than any of the other entirely ambient tracks. A lot of oily and sludgy pads floating over each other like a cloud of synth smog. Kind of like a thicker, more formless, and less catchy companion to his track Ozone from Pool. That's probably my least favorite track in this second half of the album, although being surrounded by a lot of other beat-driven material does allow it to stand out a little more easily than some of those ambient cuts the album started with. But anyway, in a mirror to how the very beginning of this album was probably my least favorite stretch, the ending 3-track stretch is probably my favorite stretch of the album. Hölzl Was a Dancer is Skee Mask's stab at some regular old summery house formulas, standard hard-hitting house beats, various processed guitar-like samples bouncing around, and this really satisfying and round bass line to underscore everything. Fittingly enough, it has to be the single most danceable cut out of everything here. Fantastic track all around. It's a better Fortet track than anything that showed up on Fortet's last album. I think I mainly made that connection because the bass line on this track kind of reminds me of that guy's track Pyramid, but still. 7 AM at the Rodeo has some of the most energetic, skittering filtered breaks on display here, underscoring these rather Metamatics-esque muted synth pad progressions with lots of stabby bass lines and other frantic arpeggios zipping around the edges. That one's a lot of fun too. And then finally we save arguably the best track for last in Vitamin 313. Well, I'm torn whether this track or Hölzl Was a Dancer is my favorite. Both are about equally excellent. But this definitely makes for as satisfying a closer to the album as I'd want, with more filtered house beats going up next to all these lush and colorful synth pads warping in and out, next to all these exceptionally pretty piano flourishes. Probably the prettiest and luscious mix of sounds and melodies out of any track on this album. This hits a similar note for me that my favorite Skee Mask track, Flyby VFR, can. Just super spacious and impressive stuff that's like really easy to immerse myself in. I think that one's going to go down as one of his all-time best productions. And yeah, that's everything on Resort. A little conflicted on this one, as you might be able to tell. I like all the parts that go into it. I like all the mixes of sounds on every track, including those comparatively less interesting ambient cuts in the beginning. And I feel like there's an experience here that I could still find easy to come back to with many more repeat listens later in the year. But the structuring and sequencing of the album seemingly being ordered in just the right way to minimize the ease with which I can give it my full attention, as well as how flighty and lacking in more visceral impacts a lot of this material can occasionally be, does leave me feeling like Resort does come up short of reaching proper greatness. In fact, I think my feelings on this album actually line up pretty closely with the way I now currently feel on Shred. That's another album that mostly runs together for me, and I mainly like for a handful of big standout moments than I do for the full package, which can occasionally be a bit hit and miss. I'm not sure which of the two I like more. I think Shred had more moments that excited me on Return Visit, but this album does have a certain vibe to it which none of his other albums have, and with how this one is clearly going for something different, I would never have the same feeling with this that I had with Shred in years previous of being nearly made redundant by clearly superior later projects like Compro and Pool. I don't know. I can't bring myself to say I properly love this album. Somehow it's not even my favorite album to have been released on that particular day, and the album with that honor was really not one I was expecting to have that honor at all. Stay tuned for that next time. But for all my feelings of not being as enthusiastic about this album as I wanted to be, I can still easily see myself hanging on to it and probably continuing to come back to it more as the year stretches on. It's not among my new favorites of his work, but it's still very good, and I'm happy to get this gentler exploration of his sound. Getting something a little different like this is more interesting than if he just kept making more Compros and Pools, so I will still take it. And I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.